When someone is drowning, you don't just stand around and let them go under. You reach down and you pull them out and you rescue them. That's what God did for me. I was born April 26, 1983, and had a fairly normal life growing up. I like to do all the things that a normal child would do: ride bikes, play with friends. Around the age of 6 or 7, my mom put me into a daycare. And that's when things really started to go south. At the daycare, people inappropriately touched me. And that really started at a very young age, jading and distorting my view of life, people, and I didn't even know what sex was at that time. During that time, my parents started to have marital problems as well at home. So things were getting very, very, very hard for me as a child. As time went on, my mom ended up taking me. My parents split up. I was 8 years old, and we moved to an apartment. I was going back and forth from my dad's house to my mom's house, and I never felt like I had security. I felt like my security was taken from me. I started hanging out with the wrong people at the apartment complex. Started experimenting at the age of 10 with smoking cigarettes, and that really opened a door to a mass downward spiral that I couldn't control. And by the age of 11, I was introduced to pot. By the age of 12, I was on Xanax, and then came 13, and that was a pivotal change for me because I tried acid for the first time. I tried it at a club. It was my very first club experience and my very first time to take acid. I found out that I was a fairly decent dancer, and I started hanging out with people that were constantly going to clubs. I fell in love with being around those types of people, being with the lights, the loud music, the dancing. I would do whatever it took for me to get in the door. It didn't matter, and people would just let me in. And I would do anything I could to keep that life going. By the age of 15, I was introduced to cocaine. That changed my life. I had energy, I was happy, but I couldn't handle the come down. The come downs, I would cry, I would be in panic, I would freak out, things would scare me. 16 came along, and that's when I was introduced to raves. The rave scene got really, really amped up during this time. It was the late 90s, and I fell in love with the people. I fell in love with the music and the drug scene. I started using ecstasy and mixing ecstasy and acid at the same time, which is called candy flipping. So I would do that every single weekend as often as I could, and do whatever I needed to do to get the money to be able to pay for my drug addiction. 17 came along, and then I was introduced to crystal meth. And on crystal meth, I realized that I could dance all night long without stopping. I was definitely enslaved to the dance floor. I started to get better and better and better at dancing. I started hanging out with hip-hop dancers, pop and lock, street style, all those things. Got so heavily involved in dancing, and my drug addiction was getting worse by the second. Ecclesiastes 1:14 talks about chasing the wind and life being meaningless, and that's exactly what I was doing the entire time. chasing the wind. During this time, as an outlet, I would write poetry. One night, I did ketamine, which is a cat tranquilizer, and I mixed it with crystal meth, and I thought that I was gonna die. And so I sat there in my room crying, and I started writing and crying out to God in my poetry book. And I wrote a poem called Help, and I thought to myself that if he was real, maybe he would answer this poem/prayer. Halfway down the poem, I couldn't think of what to write next, so the words just came to me out of the clear blue, and it said, "Take me to the place where I will stay by the bay, if that's okay." And I thought to myself, yeah, I'll just put that in there. That sounds good. That sounds catchy. So I wrote it down, and I survived that night by God's grace. 18 came along, and I went to a rave, and I got arrested for the very first time. They put me on a year probation, and I couldn't stay sober. I was still using drugs every single weekend, and got arrested again by the exact same police officer. And it all came to a screeching halt. After my second arrest, they put me in rehab for 3 months. It was a state-funded facility. Only 40 women were allowed to go, and I was one of them. As I was going into this rehab, I remember they told us to pack a week's worth of clothes. And I went and I found a suitcase buried down deep inside of my mom's closet. And I pull it out and I open it up, and there was a picture of Jesus. And I flipped it over on the back, and there was John 14:27 and Isaiah 26:3. Both of these verses talk about peace and having peace with God. I thought to myself, is God trying to talk to me if he's real? It brought me to tears in that moment, and I remember slamming the picture back down in the suitcase, stomping downstairs, and screaming at my mother because I was just so sure that she planted that in there and that this was a big plot to get me to believe in this Jesus. I couldn't handle it, and I didn't want any part of it at the time. I wasn't ready for help. I got put in rehab, and I was sober for the very first time since 11 years old. I started suffering from extreme panic attacks, terrible dreams, PTSD, and withdrawals. One day they said that we could go out for a walk if we were on good behavior. We walked to the end of the street to a park at the corner, and lo and behold, the park was called By the Bay. I realized in that moment that God was real and that he was reaching out to me, trying to save me. But I was so confused and couldn't believe that I wrote this down 2 years previous, and that poem, prayer, was answered. I continued to suffer from severe panic attacks, and so I knew that I had to quit using drugs. My body was completely rejecting it, and I knew that I had to stop. So I turned to drinking, from one addiction to another. I drank severely for 10 years after that. I couldn't stop. I would go out to bars and clubs and raves and just continue the same old pattern, just a different chemical. I struggled with thoughts of suicide. I would lay down on my bed and beg to die. I would cry myself to sleep countless and countless and countless nights. I was broken and desperate and in a prison that I couldn't get out of. I begged to die. I just wanted to not live anymore. All I saw around me was darkness constantly, and I just couldn't get out. I didn't know what to do. I was desperate for change. And then one day, I go to a club and I got drugged. Someone found me on the stage, completely passed out. And I woke up the next morning on some couch that I didn't recognize. I didn't know where I was. I didn't know where my car was. And I couldn't stop throwing up. I called my mom asking for her to take me to the hospital. But the thing is I had been to the hospital several times for alcohol poisoning. She was tired and she said no. And that's what drove me to be at the very rock bottom of my present hell that I was living in. I went to church with my mom 2 weeks later, still completely hungover from the night before. My pastor at the time did an altar call, and I just kept thinking to myself, I don't need this. I don't need this. I got this. And then towards the end of the altar call, it clicked in my mind, and all of a sudden it was like Jesus turned on the light. And so there I was, running all the way down to the very altar that day, sobbing my face off, and I said yes to Jesus. I spent 2.5 hours in the prayer room after that, crying my eyes out to the prayer warrior that was attending me. And she just poured out on me God's love and grace and forgiveness. And she kept praying over me. It was as if all of the chains from the past had broke and I felt lighter. That was such a radical experience for me. I knew that it was real. 2 Corinthians 5:17 says that when you give your life to Christ, you become a new creation. He gives you a new life and a new beginning. It's just like the caterpillar starting out, going into a cocoon, spending its time there until it's ready to be rebirthed, reborn into a new creation, a butterfly. I flew out of that church that day, a beautiful butterfly in God's eyes. He changed everything for me. I started going to church on a regular basis. I started reading the Bible for myself to see what it said. The more that I read the Bible, the more that I went to church, the deeper I went into God, and the more He poured Himself out on me. There was so much healing that just came rushing in from all of those years past of pain and misery. And shortly after that, He brought me into a beautiful honeymoon. I would have people come up to me randomly and just be like, God told me to buy you flowers today, or God told me to buy you a computer, or whatever it was. And I would get all of these amazing gifts from Him on a regular basis, and I would just cry every single time because I couldn't believe that this was happening to me.
I remember just going outside, looking at the sun rays shining through the clouds, thinking it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. It was as if I had never seen the sky before. It was such a nice change to be awake during the day.
But God didn't stop there. He told me to go to ministry school, and I fought Him on that for quite some time. I grew up dyslexic, and therefore I was believing a lie that I wasn't smart enough for school. I knew that I had to be obedient, so I went and I graduated in 2017, and it was one of the most successful, meaningful times of my life. Shortly after that, God started revealing what He wanted me to do. And that's when Heart of Dance was born. It means so much to me to be able to give back to the people to where I came from. I'm so eternally grateful to my Lord and Savior Jesus Christ for allowing me to share my story and my testimony. And I know that God's not finished with me yet. He's just scratching the surface.
When the night is closing in, don't give up and don't give in. This won't last, it's not the end, it's not the end. You're gonna be okay.
My name is Tiffany, and this is my God story.